Hello and welcome to the Down-to-Earth Access Governance webinar series. Today we'll specifically talk about provisioning and everything related to building roles and processes in order to automate the assignment of IT permissions to users. Taking a look here at today's agenda, we see how our discussion is outlined. First, we'll dedicate a few seconds to us, cross ideas. Secondly, we'll discuss the idea of provisioning that makes compliance sense. From an end-user standpoint, what does it look like? How is it organized? We'll see how a large mass of users can rely on identity and access governance applications to manage their entitlement lifecycles. Thirdly, we'll take a brief behind-the-scenes look at the steps that are required to implement provisioning that makes compliance sense. These steps include onboarding applications, designing roles, and in particular, we'll discuss some additional role mining capabilities that the Cross-Idea solution offers in addition to traditional top-down role modeling. We'll talk about applying controls to roles. This will include not just segregation of duties, but other types of controls as well. We'll talk about designing processes, which are the key components used to automate provisioning. First off, we'd like to share a little information about us, Cross Ideas. We're the only European company located in the right side of the Identity and Access Governance Magic Quadrant, and we're quite proud of that. Our capabilities demonstrate that we are the European vendor in the identity and access governance arena. However, the purpose of today's webinar isn't to celebrate our achievements, but rather to examine the topics that we've outlined. Before getting to that, though, we feel it's important to highlight that we are approaching our customers, partners, and the market in general with what we call a maturity path or a life cycle. A few years ago, many customers wanted to immediately focus their efforts on automating everything related to the role design process. These same customers today are now taking a bit of a softer approach, more in step with the way these types of projects are currently funded and budgeted. These projects are still IT implementations, but more and more their funding is coming not necessarily from IT budgets, but from compliance, audit, and finance budgets. So the first step in our maturity path is that of understanding the risk, basically collecting data and detecting the risk. Some call this access intelligence. We call it the detective component of access governance. Step 2 involves reducing or cleaning up the risk, and access certification or access review are fantastic ways to accomplish this. Once the risk has been cleaned up or reduced, we can move on to the third and final step of the life cycle where we build roles and we model automation. Why, though, is this process the third step? Well, if we immediately start out by modeling roles, we would basically just be modeling the automation over top of a mess. And thus, in the past, many provisioning projects started propagating complete chaos. Acting simply on the desire to automate everything, the activating, deactivating, and changing of applications was performed without any real control. There may have been a measure of IT efficiency, but it led to chaos in terms of segregation of duties and the need-to-know principles that govern the security arena today. This is something that years of evidence has irrefutably demonstrated. Let's move on to one of today's topics, that of preventing the risk. We're going to start by taking a look at not the customer side, but the end-user side. When we implement this software in companies, there is both a behind-the-scenes component as well as a front-end component. It's important to see what the interface looks like for ordinary business users. There are many processes, but let's start out with one of the classical, more typical processes. A manager who needs to create an access request for one of his or her direct reports. In this case, George Freund is the manager, and he wants to grant a new role or permission to Katie Martin. He logs into the Access and Identity Self-Service portal and starts by clicking on Create Access Request. At this point, George needs to first make a selection. And this specific example is just one of the many that demonstrate a very common approach used by companies that have trouble modeling business roles. And by business roles, we mean aggregating IT permissions that span more than one application, perhaps SAP, Active Directory, or a mainframe application. In most cases, though, when adopting this solution, we frequently see companies taking the approach saying, okay, I want to select the application which already incorporates processes I know, something in my language, so to speak. And this is the example we're considering today. So back to George's situation. George thus selects SAP Corporate to indicate that Katie Martin requires a new permission on SAP Corporate. If we look at the upper left-hand portion of the screen, we see that George is a manager in the procurement department. Thus, we want to keep in mind that George cannot see the entire list of applications. This page only shows applications that are visible to the procurement business unit. And later on, we'll see how visibility rules are used to control which applications and entitlements are made visible to specific organization units. So from the end user's perspective, though, it's quite simple. Users only see what they're allowed to see. After selecting a specific SAP, George can see which permissions are available for assignment. This is something that Katie does not see. George, though, says, okay, I want Katie to have permission to authorize and manage purchase orders. So he selects it and tries to move on. Notice, though, that he's notified about a potential risk. The system detects that if George grants this permission to Katie Martin, she will have an SOD violation. And here we want to highlight something very specific. We haven't assigned another role to Katie. In fact, in SAP, the word role tends to be a bit misleading. We've really just assigned a granular permission within an application. Moving on, though, notice that the details of the SOD conflict are listed using both business and IT language. The system notifies George that there is a conflicting activity or business process if Katie Martin owns the transactions SAP Corp CRM Buyer and SAP Corp CMM Manager. At this point, George can decide to abandon the request, or as is often the case, the SOD violation needs to stay, and George, our manager, can decide to maintain the SOD risk. It could be that there is no other person available except Katie Martin who can carry out the required task. So George says, that's okay, I'll go ahead and approve it. The whole system changes direction, though, as the workflow now has to take this SOD violation into account. Now there's an event, which is a security violation that needs to be reviewed and approved. In this case, Hannon Rosenblatt, the operational risk manager who may be with IT security, is required to approve the exception and assign mitigation controls, which are key components of the risk management paradigm. In essence, we don't remove the risk, but we keep it and add additional processes on top of it. For example, we could apply a two-person rule, where someone else oversees the specific situation that is required to be kept in place. So this is a very simple example of an access request flow, which has incorporated a few compliance concepts. However, we really haven't spoken of roles yet. Up to this point, we've been talking about granting application permissions. We have seen, though, how SOD violations are detected. We've also seen how visibility rules determine what an end user sees, in this case, which applications our manager George Freund was allowed to see. Now let's move from the front office to behind the scenes. It's simple, but we want to go through the steps that enable this transition. The Cross Ideas approach divides the transition into 4 building blocks. One is the integration component, which is basically exchanging data within the application to be controlled or provisioned. A second block is the modeling portion, and role modeling is one of the 2 paradigms in this block. Then there are also controls. We want to note, though, that roles are not the same as controls. Controls are things like segregation of duties and detection of orphaned or service accounts. Roles are for provisioning, while controls are used for detecting any risk that may be present, regardless of whether we're in a detective or preventative access governance mode. But once controls are in place, countermeasures are required. Countermeasures range from simple reporting to recertification to access request, which is something that we'll see more of today. If we try to highlight the path that we're presenting today, we'll see what can be done in the collection phase. Moving on, we'll see how roles are modeled, and in particular, the role mining approach. Then we'll explain how to run a compliance check on the roles generated from the role mining phase. We'll then move into designing the countermeasures, which in this case are processes that automate the access request. And lastly, we'll look at the write back step, which synchronizes the changes back to the target. Now, let's talk about the first step, which is user and entitlement collection. As you probably have noticed, over the past few years, the obsession with building automatic connectors for everything has diminished dramatically. A lot of companies are automatically collecting data from applications, but are much more relaxed when it comes to having a great connector directly to the application. And this is not a technical issue, because in many cases we have application owners, SAP, or mainframe application owners, who when it comes to data exchange, prefer a more loosely coupled approach. And in many cases, this is a simple CSV file exchange, which ensures that these new identity and access governance forks do not pollute the mission-critical application. So let's look at the first step, that of the collection phase. Taking a look at the bottom left of our slide, we can see a screenshot of the connectors used for collecting data from the target system. Here, we want to highlight a key process, reconciliation. Thanks to reconciliation, we don't have to spend a fortune on bidirectional read-write connectors to detect if the applications that are to be integrated are out of sync with the identity and access governance system. Reconciliation provides us with what we call intelligence information. In this case, a report showing specific permissions, names, surnames, etc. If we look at the slide, we'll see that this data has been deleted because it comes from a real customer. At any rate, this information is provided in the form of a report, as we said, and it has to do with a specific account that needs to be removed from the target. This could be an account that is still alive but can't be reconciled to a physical human being. Or it could be the other way around. Perhaps there's an account, or even more granular, a permission, that needs to be removed from a person. So this is the key component of the onboarding or read-from phase. And again, it's called reconciliation. Here we get information regarding orphan accounts and orphan permissions, as well as information which is part of the risk detection capability. Now we move on to role modeling. We start by onboarding the data from all the applications that we want to control. The best way to control an application so that access rights can be granted more quickly and efficiently is to design roles, which basically are aggregated permissions from one or multiple applications, and this is known as provisioning. The bottom-up role mining approach is used when companies don't want to exclusively use the top-down approach. Let's now take a look at how we implement role mining. To begin with, we don't simply rely on database querying. Rather, we use various algorithms to balance a number of factors. For example, if we want to eliminate redundancy of an existing role model. Our example at hand, though, uses what we call the optimal role set algorithm. This is used in situations where we start with a clean slate, where we have no roles and we need the tool to suggest initial candidate roles that can then be approved and used for provisioning. We then minimize or maximize the parameters. Here we minimize the OU spread since we want to create roles that are centered around the organization unit, or the OU. We could also, though, build roles that are not related to the OU, but instead are built around the application. So we might have a role which spans people belonging to multiple OUs, but that is built around a single application. There are a number of parameters that we can manipulate. We can have our own parameters as part of the data onboarding process. We can then use these to conduct an extended analysis on an extended data set. This allows us to determine which role mining process is the most cost-effective. And in a moment, we'll elaborate more on what we mean by cost-effective. So the system triggers an analysis that produces a list of candidate roles. Here we have roles 1 through 7 that we see on the left portion of the slide. These suggested roles vary in the number of users and the number of entitlements. For each and every role, we can browse various dimensions. The most helpful is the visual map, which we see on the right-hand side of the slide. The visual map shows a partition of users and IT permissions. Along the top, we see names, and on the left-hand side of the map, we see Active Directory and CRN Clarify permissions. We see that role 2 is a combination of specific users with specific permissions, and this is a result of the algorithm that we chose to apply. The tool allows us to manipulate the visual map. We can extend it, stretch it, we can zoom into the map, we can zoom out of the map. Keep in mind, though, that this tool is not for the ordinary user. It's more for the role engineer, as specific technical skills are required to use it. However, the tool can still be used to support business cases during role modeling workshops. Once we've modeled and produced an efficient role according to our parameter set, we have an efficiency angle. The system tells us that this role can reduce the individual number of permissions that we're granting. So if we start assigning or revoking permissions using this role, we can reduce the amount of time the company dedicates to the role. An important part, though, is what we call compliance validation. Let's comment for a moment now on the efficiency or cost effectiveness of the role, as we had mentioned earlier. The cost effectiveness translates to the time we save by not having to assign or revoke individual access rights. We can achieve this savings by simply assigning the suggested candidate roles. The system tells us that if we use suggested candidate roles we get from the role mining tool, we'll achieve an efficiency of close to 53%. Note that we're not eliminating the possibility of assigning individual access rights. Again, we're not obsessed with creating a role for every situation under the sun. The tool may in fact suggest a group of permissions available as a role and some single entitlements which may still be granted on an individual basis. In essence, we can play around with this to see the various levels of efficiency that we're capable of achieving. But as we mentioned before, validation is an important step, so let's move into how we can check the modeled role against existing SOD policies. Our SOD business modeling is not based on roles, it's based on business activities. And the nice thing about business activity modeling is the ability to detect SOD violations from both a business and a technical standpoint, not just for users, but also for entitlements, which could consist of a role, an IT role, a job role, or a specific permission. An IT role is built around a single application. A job role is an aggregation of permissions, or an IT role that is built across multiple applications. Why is role validation useful here? Well, in many cases, the role approval process consists of numerous sign-offs to avoid disseminating a mess of SOD violations once we start provisioning with the new role. So therefore, we perform a compliance check which, in the end, saves us a lot of time in terms of reviews and sign-offs. In summary, this step allows us to validate the newly designed role against current SOD policies. Once we verify the role has no SOD violations, we can define the role's visibility. Think back for a moment to our earlier example of George Freund, the procurement manager, who was requesting access rights for his direct report, Katie Martin. We mentioned that there were some limitations on what George had visibility of. So it's at this point of the process that we determine what George can see by modeling the visibility. On the left side of the picture, we see the OU structure, which is an unlimited hierarchy. For each level here, in this case for the sales business unit, we're setting which entitlements the business unit can see when requesting access rights through the self-service portal. This consists nothing more than the short list that we see here. We want to emphasize this because we see some of our competitors presenting the entire list of applications and the entire list of roles and entitlements. Therefore, we want to highlight how our method offers the option to provide more discipline and visibility restriction. But if we want to let everyone see every role or permission in the application information catalog, we can still do so. Going that route, though, has a trade-off in terms of cost effectiveness. It will cost more on the approval side since we have to spend more time validating it all. This modeling is also useful for detective access governance because if we can detect the read-from time at which Katie Martin was assigned a permission outside of the visibility of her business unit, we can raise an alert. This is a very coarse-grained SOD modeling of sorts, which is also applied to OU visibility. We call this out-of-band violation. Once we move away from the governance phase, and we start defining processes and workflows, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Cross Ideas includes, with the tool, a library of pre-existing processes for granting, revoking, delegating access rights, etc. and we can use these to model any process or workflow that we want to manage. So if we want to add delegation capabilities to our workflow, we can simply take advantage of the corresponding components that are already included in the CrossIdeas Process Designer. These processes can be modified if we wish, but they do offer pretty much everything we need. Now we'll discuss how we can write back the changes we've made. And we want to make a comment about user and entitlement provisioning here. To write back changes that we have made, such as an account or a permission that has been removed, there are two ways to go about it. Either through the connector or by way of manual fulfillment, which essentially notifies the service desk or the application owner and tells them to complete the process. The former, manual fulfillment, is quite convenient and cost-effective in situations where there is not a lot of turnover in the application and a lot of changes are not expected. Reconciliation, which we examined earlier, detects when a specific permission has not been deleted once the owner has been notified. This is a drastic difference from traditional provisioning implementation, which bases everything on bidirectional read-write connectors. But of course, if we want write-back connectivity, we need to be allowed to select it. So here we have the same example, the same JDBC connector that we saw in the reconciliation read-from channel, and we go the other way around to write back to the application. Again, this is not so much a technical issue. Instead, it's more related to project scope, because writing back to applications might require extensive meetings with application owners, which sometimes might not be worth the effort. However, this is the bidirectional use of the same connector we looked at before, just writing back. In the case of applications such as SAP, this is an out-of-box connector. Otherwise, there are a number of other connectors for standard JDBC, LDAP, and Active Directory targets. Let's briefly recap what we've seen together. First, we spoke of collection of users and entitlements. We then moved these into the role mining process where we define candidate roles. Our next step was to evaluate these candidate roles against existing SOD policies. We then assigned visibility controls, assigning some selected permissions to specific business units. We referred to this as out-of-band control, which serves to detect violations of the visibility restrictions that we have applied. Next, we went on to define access request processes, all standard processes required for this type of automation. Once these processes were defined, we then addressed user and entitlement write-back, or as we call it, provisioning of accounts or entitlements. So how can we sum up what we've discussed today? Well, we looked at first the maturity path or life cycle, which starts out with understanding the risks. We contrasted this with what we referred to as connector obsession, getting the data, getting visibility of who can do what, and then viewing the risks. We then talked about access certification, cleaning up the mess, so to speak, if there is one, or validating the current situation. Then, the third step was risk prevention, changing how we request and revoke permissions. To do that, we started talking about role modeling. And honestly, we cannot achieve proper role modeling without first going through steps 1 and 2. All too often, these steps are neglected, identifying and understanding the risk and then taking necessary steps to prevent that risk. And that's why, during 2007 to 2008, so many projects that were implemented fell short of their desired expectations. They delivered great bidirectional connectors, but yet they provided no real business control. That's the story of access governance. There's 3 things that we'd like to highlight, though, about CrossIdeas. First, we want to stress the importance of a single platform solution for access governance and user provisioning. We continue to hear less and less in the market regarding the distinction between access governance and provisioning. Why is this? Well, it's because they're really 2 sides of the same coin that leads us to manage a single life cycle for these processes. Another reason why we stress the importance of a single platform solution is because there are vendors out there who either have strictly the old technical provisioning approach, or they are requiring 2 separate products to deliver access governance and provisioning. Oracle and NetIQ are prime examples of this, where we see duplication of connectors and identity repositories, etc. That's not the case, however, with CrossIdeas. We offer both controls in a single piece of software. The second point we want to recall is the unique visual role mining approach that CrossIdeas offers. Role mining was a mess when it was not being designed with people involved. It has thus always been complicated designing roles strictly from an IT perspective. That's why many failed in what we call the Identity Management 1.0 project. There were also important stakeholders missing from that project, stakeholders that are now present in the governance project. The business side of things, which includes security, compliance, auditing. Role mining now combines both approaches, a bottom-up IT approach together with a top-down business approach. So really, it's this combination that makes current role techniques so successful. Again, CrossIdeas provides this unique capability, which is especially seen in our tool's ability to visually map candidate roles. The third point we want to reiterate is CrossIdeas' unique approach to modeling segregation of duties. Analysts such as Gartner and Kuppinger refer to this as business-driven segregation of duties, which supports both detective and preventative approaches by incorporating a business activity model. This approach allows for sophisticated compliance validation on the roles that are generated. So here at the end of our webinar, we want to take the opportunity to thank you for having followed us today, and we hope that you'll join into another one of our webinars in the near future. Bye-bye.